Welcome to the best video about thyroid ever. Yeah, sorry about the clickbait, but this is going to look at the sort of things you can expect if you're sent to have a blood test regarding your thyroid function, to be honest. So you can look at many different things when you have blood. I'm a specialist practitioner in obesity and diabetes. I do have a science degree, but mainly this will be looking at my phlebotomy work. I've seen thousands of blood tests, and people always ask the same questions about the thyroid panel. So I'm not offering any medical advice, just really interpreting different things you can get from your thyroid panel and what to ask for, actually, because many people don't really understand their results and what actually you can get from your phlebotomist. So when you're looking at thyroid, you can either think about hypothyroidism or hypothyroidism. Hypo tends to mean slow. If you ever see hypo in any particular context, it just means that's below a certain level. So with hypothyroidism, that tends to mean you don't have enough thyroid hormone either being produced or activating. And that can mean that you feel sort of quite cold, or you're sluggish, no pun intended, if you look at the bottom left-hand corner. And some people are hyperthyroidism. That means in the main, you might have an elevated heart rate, for instance, and that can lead to a lot of fatigue. In fact, both situations can lead to fatigue, but for different causes. Okay, so the thyroid is a gland located in the throat. Most people say it's a sort of butterfly shape, but how does it know what to do? Well, things start in the hypothalamus, which is a region in the brain, and that will be sensing information coming back from the body, and that will be looking at thyroid hormone that is circulating. And the hypothalamus will talk to the pituitary gland, and how it does that, it releases a thing called thyroid releasing hormone, or TRH. Many people don't get that in the blood panel, but it's just something for you to know that there is a sensory network, there is a feedback system that's going on, and TRH is the beginning of it, although when we say that, it is really a loop, because it's getting information back from the body based on the thyroid hormones that are circulating. But anyway, so we've got to start somewhere. So up in the brain there in the hypothalamus, you get TRH, thyroid tropin releasing hormone, or thyroid releasing hormone is what most people call it now. And that TRH, that stimulates the pituitary gland, which is a smaller gland in the brain again, and this will stimulate the release of thyroid stimulating hormone. Now, this is called TSH. That's what it's shortened down to. Most people know it as TSH. Remember, this isn't a thyroid hormone. It's a pituitary gland hormone, but it is talking to the thyroid gland, and it's basically stimulating it to do something, to kickstart into action. And the thyroid gland will be producing a couple of the most major hormones that we talk about when we're looking at health, and that is a thing called T4. The T just stands for thyroid, and the 4 stands for how many iodine molecules or atoms there are, T4. And T3 is produced. That's the active form of the thyroid hormone. And there's also a thing called reverse T3, which mainly comes from T4, and it is converted sometimes into reverse T3. Many people will wonder whether that is something that really exists, because they don't see it on many thyroid panels, but it is something you need to ask for. There was an old school way of thinking that if your TSH, your thyroid stimulating hormone, was sufficient or within a normal range, then everything must be hunky-dory, because that's working as part of the feedback system. If the TSH, the thyroid stimulating hormone, is within normal levels, people would assume, hang on a minute, well, that must mean that everything is great and the feedback is working. But it doesn't take into consideration dysregulation of thyroid hormone later on in the body, in peripheral tissues. There's lots of other things that could mess up the feedback system, and also the range, the normal range, which we often talk about in our meetings, in the steak and butter girl meetings, for instance. Normal range doesn't mean optimal health range, and it's a very broad range from about 0.5 to 5. So, for instance, if you had 3 blood tests in a row over 3 months and you saw your TSH go from 0.5 to 1.5 to 3.5, you've got a trend there that's saying maybe there is something wrong because your TSH is going up, and you can be quite forensic and start doing some investigations as to why that is. So just want to quickly talk about reverse T3, which is very often missed out when people talk about the thyroid panel. It doesn't mean it's the most important one, why I'm talking about this first, but it is something that people don't really talk about. And it can bind to the sites, the receptors for active T3, and sort of work like a brake on the cell. So it is something that you need to look at. And you can look at a ratio of T3 and reverse T3 in relation to how much T4 you're pumping out. And we'll come back to that in a little bit more detail. But high reverse T3 slows down the metabolic rate. It attaches to the cell receptor, which is normally reserved for the 3T3, which is the thing that goes into the cell and starts to make the metabolic rate go up or keep you working at a normal level. Anyway, let's go into a little bit more basics again. So T4, if you think of it as like the storage hormone ready to be converted, it's handy to know how much of that is in the body and ready to be converted whenever the body needs it. And in the main, it's converted to active T3. And T3, thyroid with 3 iodines, basically, all that means, it will go into the cell and it will rev up the metabolic rate. That's a whole point of T3, to be activated from T4, go into the cell and regulate the activity of that cell. So let's go back to storage hormone T4. It's ready to be called upon, but sometimes, like I say, it gets converted to reverse T3, and that can have a protective effect. It could be slowing down the metabolic rate for many different causes. So when you have a thyroid panel, it's always good to ask for not only the T3, the TSH and the T4, but to ask for reverse T3 as well. It really gives you a fantastic idea of what's going on in the body, especially in regards, obviously, to the thyroid operation. So think of T3, reverse T3, as a brake. So why is this important? Well, reverse T3 can only be made from T4. So if we get a measure of the conversion rate, we can really work out exactly what's happening and what the feedback coming back from the body is telling the, well, firstly, the hypothalamus and also then the pituitary gland what to do. Always remember, with blood tests, it is very important to think about what you're presenting with what are your symptoms, because it isn't just about numbers, it is about your health and what your presentation is. So if you get a thyroid panel and you're interested to work out the ratio of 3T3 to reverse T3, there are plenty of online calculators that can do that for you, and they'll give you a really good idea of how to interpret those results. So just to go into a little bit more of the sort of geeky science for those that have never heard of reverse T3 or T4 or T3, you have an amino acid. These come from food, the amino acids, tyrosine, and they will join together, and then there will be iodine atoms attaching in certain places. So here we've got the amino acid, it joins with another amino acid, and then you've got these atoms of iodine on there. So this is T4, this is thyroxine T4, and that's the configuration. If you look at this, this is active T3. You can see this is the pattern, and it's got the 3 iodines, and reverse T3 has a different configuration, and that different configuration gives it a different mechanism in the body. So that's the inactive form of T3, basically, reverse T3. And then other blood panels will look at antibodies, TPO and TG antibodies. And this is more to do with the possibility of an autoimmune issue arising. Again, don't want to get too geeky and too sciencey in this video, but TG just stands for thyroglobulin, and TPO just stands for thyroid peroxidase, which are 2 enzymes which are really important in the construction of thyroid hormone. And you might find that the body is attacking the thyroid peroxidase, so that's TPO, or it might be attacking the thyroglobulin, and that's obviously the TG. So the antibodies are detected, and that can indicate an autoimmune issue. But again, there are ranges. So for instance, a real live example of somebody was worried because their TPO levels were 70, whereas the normal range takes up to about 35 before there's any possibility of an autoimmune issue. But when you look at the possibility of someone with a level of 70 eventually ending up with an autoimmune issue in their thyroid, it's very low. In fact, even over 500, it's something like 10% of people end up with an autoimmune issue in the thyroid. So it is just a marker, but can give you a lot more information, so you can be very forensic about what's happening with your health. This is what a full thyroid panel looks like. This really is the gold standard, where you've got TSH being measured, and then you've got T4, you've got free T4, then you've got T3, free T3, and then reverse T3, and then you've got the two antibodies. That is about as good as you'll get. And they will always give you this reference range. And like I say, these are not optimal health ranges. These are just normal ranges taken from a whole range of people that have had blood tests, and these are just averages. So I can't stress that enough, because you could be, like for instance, this TSH is within range, and it's not particularly high, but it could also be 4.2. So that's right at the top end. And if in context with other things, you could look at that and think, oh, well, everything else looks okay, but why is that TSH high? So you need to have all the details there. So this person, like I say, the antibodies are really low. So the TPO, you want it to be less than 35, like we said. For instance, down here, that person had 70, so that was a bit of a worry, because it looks like it's double what it should be. But of course, like I say, some people have a range where it's up to 500 and they don't have any particular issues. But that is high. But obviously, trying to just give you context of the numbers. So like I say, thyroglobulin antibodies, that test looks for antibodies that attack the thyroglobulin, which is an enzyme. Okay, so under normal circumstances, doesn't enter the bloodstream. But if your thyroid is inflamed or under attack from the body's own immune system, then thyroglobulin can be secreted, and it will have antibodies detected. So that's how that works. And obviously, thyroid peroxidase antibodies, exactly the same thing. It's looking at some impairing of the thyroid function. So just to go back to its basics, so we can talk about the whole circle, because like I said at the beginning, there is no real starting point, because there's constant feedback going to the hypothalamus to release the TRH, and then that talks to the pituitary gland to release TSH, and then speak to the thyroid hormone, and then you've got T3, T4, reverse T3 circulating in the system, and that system or systemic amount of T3 and T4 is then being fed back up into the brain, and the whole circle carries on and on again. So that's the whole point here. There is constant monitoring. So when you do a blood test, it's always good to do more than one blood test over a period of time. You can then detect trends. So for instance, if you did one in January, another one in April, then another one in July, and the numbers are all pretty much the same, you could think, well, this system's working really well. But if you saw, for instance, TSH constantly going up, you might want to look into more depth at the ratios of how much of T4 is being activated into the real thing that matters, T3, active T3 is the thing that really matters, and how much of that T4 is going into reverse T3. And then we come back to symptoms. So like I say, if you're feeling fine, but the numbers don't say that, then you have to work out why those numbers are higher. But more often than not, if the numbers are high, you probably have got some symptoms. So hypothyroidism, you can see your hair loss, you've got a puffy face. A loss of eyebrow hair is really interesting, because that's something that I picked up on myself as a thing to be aware of. But then when I had the panel and looked at all my other symptoms, there was no problems. An enlarged thyroid, so your throat actually is still a little bit swollen. A slow heartbeat can be an indication of hypothyroidism. Poor appetite. As everything is slowing down, it makes sense that there might be some constipation. Heavy periods are another thing, and you can feel very cool. your temperature. Your body temperature could be cool, and you could see some swelling of the limbs. And most people have heard of Hashimoto's who are interested in the thyroid, and that is just one particular condition, an autoimmune disease. And there are the symptoms there: the dry and thinning hair, the enlarged inflamed thyroid. You get some joint and muscle pain, which is coming from the fatigue and the fact that there's not enough active T3 going on to make sure that your metabolic rate is revved up. And again, periods can have a big problem there. And I just wanted to get back into reminding people that it is T4 that becomes reverse T3. So when you do the panel, you are measuring TSH, like I say, from the pituitary gland, which goes down to the thyroid gland. And you're looking at how much T4 is produced and how much T3 is being produced coming from T4, the reverse T3, which is the inactive form. And these give you some idea of percentages. So the T4 there is looking to produce 100 micrograms per day. And of that, about, a quarter or 25% is becoming active T3. And then we haven't got figures for the reverse T3 because there's not enough people currently doing the blood panel which involves the reverse T3, so we don't know exactly what's going on there at the moment. And the initial active T3 is about 5 to 6% of that directly from the thyroid going straight into the system. So these numbers you can work out are pretty important. In context, you want to get the whole picture rather than just the basics. So if you want to take a screenshot of the glossary, this just goes through all the things that we've just talked about and a brief description of what each one does and sort of percentages in your body and how it's carried around the body. And then there's other things to consider. Your iron status, ferritin levels is possibly a thing that you could look at if you're worried about your thyroid function. And selenium levels, because selenium is a cofactor, it's something that's very important in the manufacture of thyroid hormone. It's good to get the levels. Some people online are just recommending, well, supplement with selenium, which could be pretty toxic if it isn't selenium that is the problem. So it's always good if you're thinking about a thyroid panel, if you want to go a little bit more broader in your investigation to see what's actually happening physiologically, then iron status and selenium levels are pretty good to add. Riboflavin, vitamin D, and folate, again, because they're all involved in processes that can impact on thyroid function. B vitamins tend to come up quite a lot. And your inflammation status, so the CRP, C-reactive protein, and HS just stands for high sensitivity. So if you've got low levels of inflammation, that will still be picked up. And insulin levels, again, dialing back into inflammation. If you had the full thyroid panel and those particular tests, then you would really have a great idea of what's going on. So like I say, the test for selenium before supplementing is really important. And also there's other genetic factors. The MTHFR mutation is something that can be something to look into if you're really getting into a deep dive and looking at things like 23andMe and looking at genetic factors as well. I don't want to get too deep with this. I'm just trying to be very basic for people that want to do a full thyroid function and understand that it can have just huge effects on their energy levels and their metabolic rate. So just the last couple of bits, just for you to take screenshots of if you want to know a little bit more about things we're talking through here. Thyroid hormones are poorly soluble in water, so they are always bound, or pretty much most of the time, 99% of the time, they're bound to carrier proteins. And the principle of the carrier there of the thyroid hormones is to bind and to work around the system, and obviously the liver is involved in that as well. So always talk to a medical professional about your results. If you have symptoms, that's the main takeaway from this, that you can get a bit of an understanding about your thyroid panel. Do remember that if you have symptoms, that is more important than numbers. Always treat the patient at what they're presenting with rather than the numbers that you're looking at. So in phlebotomy, I've had so many results where someone's worried, oh, my levels of folate are really low. And then I ask, are you anemic? Are your gums bleeding? Those sort of things. No, there's no problem. And I would say, well, it's something to keep an eye on, but you're not presenting with any serious symptoms. You're feeling pretty much in good health, so don't worry about those levels. And that just is true of all blood tests, really. They're just biomarkers, and they are a snapshot in time. You will find that if you did these tests over 3 or 4 weeks or 3 or 4 months with intervals in between, those numbers would be very dynamic and constantly changing. So hopefully that was interesting. If you've got any comments, just comment down below. Give me a thumbs up or subscribe if you like these sort of videos. Any more questions or comments, I always try to answer them, but thank you very much for watching.